You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Owen Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello everyone and welcome to episode 37 of the Book Talk Today podcast. Today we are joined by Violet Moller. Violet is an independent historian with a particular interest in the history of ideas and how knowledge has been transmitted through the centuries. She has a Ph.D. on the libraries in early modern Britain and is the host of the Travels Through Time History podcast, which asks a wide range of brilliant historians which year they would choose if they could travel back in time. Today we'll be discussing her book, The Map of Knowledge, How Classical Ideas Were Lost and Found, A History of Seven Cities. Violet, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank
you very much for asking me.
You're welcome. So, as we were discussing before we started recording, I mean, this subject fascinates me to no end. I think a great place to start would be, how did you transition from doing your PhD on the libraries of early modern Britain to then transitioning to focusing on the East with this book?
Well, there was quite a long period of time in between when I actually finished my PhD and when I started writing this book. But the ideas for the book were definitely inspired in part by my thesis, which, as you mentioned, focused on this library catalogue from 1583, a library that was collected by a man called John Dee in Elizabethan London. And I noticed when I was assessing the catalogue, and in particular the author catalogue, that there were so many names of Persian or Arabic origin. And in my own historical education, I just hadn't been aware of that enormous contribution that part of the world made to the general history of science. So that sort of sparked my interest. But actually, I was living in Denmark when I finished my PhD, and I wasn't, I wanted to be a writer, but I hadn't kind of got there yet. So there were several years in between when I did other things. And then I moved back to England and wrote a couple of books for the Bodleian Library on completely different subjects. And then I thought, okay, well, maybe this is the moment to try and fulfill my childhood dream of writing a proper history book. And I suggested the idea. I'd got in touch with an agent and I suggested the idea, and she really liked it. So I was very excited. And then I went home and just thought, oh my goodness, what have I done? It's 1,000 years of history. How am I ever going to be able to do this? But yeah, it was such a joy. The research was so interesting. I loved every minute of it. So
how did you approach it with that many years, and how did you go about sort of culminating so much research and approaching it?
Well, I did it very much chapter by chapter. Okay. So it is a journey, and each chapter focuses on a different city. So I pretty much started at the beginning. The first chapter I wrote was actually Baghdad, which I think in retrospect was a mistake, because that was the place that I knew the least about. I wasn't able to go there and visit. That was a baptism of fire. It was very, very difficult, but it was probably, in some ways it was good, because it just meant that once I got going, the rest of the book was easier. And by the time I reached Venice, which is the last chapter, I was on sort of quite familiar ground. That kind of overlapped a lot with a lot of my other research that I had done. And also I visited Venice quite a few times. So I think that was one of the things that I really wanted to do with my book, was give people a really vivid sense of the places. I think that's a really important part of writing popular history, is, really trying to bring it to life and talk about, what it would have smelt like and what you would have seen walking on the streets and that kind of thing. And sometimes, that takes quite a leap of imagination. But then with Venice, it doesn't, because you go to Venice today and it basically looks the same as it would have looked in the 16th century. It hasn't changed very much. I think the chimney pots have been replaced with TV aerials. That's kind of the main physical difference.
Yeah, but as opposed to like a city like Baghdad, which I've visited, and the way that you describe in the book, and I'm very very attuned to that period of history as well because of religion as well. So there's a lot of history during that time, and you talk about it in the book to a degree. And you go now, and it's obviously nowhere near in the level of opulence as it was previously. So, I mean, how did you approach writing that if you weren't able to visit?
The really a wonderful thing about that, the sort of 9th and 10th centuries in Baghdad, is that we have so much, there's such rich source material for it. So that there is a lot of information, luckily in translation, because I cannot, I can't read Arabic at all.
Yeah.
But there's quite a lot of information, and I think you just, that's really for me what being a historian is being able to read stuff and take in information and then just kind of go into yourself and just really try and imagine it. It's so much about imagination. I think it's really important to be able to kind of think yourself back into a different place and time.
Yeah, put yourself in the shoes of someone who lived during that time.
Exactly.
Which is very difficult, obviously, but I think that is somewhat the challenge and the beauty of it as well. So I think it would be good to sort of just have a little conversation about each one of the cities. Starting off really in the first chapter, you talk about the city of Alexandria, and I think anyone who knows the city of Alexandria would know that it's very much known for the library that it had in the past. Anyone who loves to read knows about the Library of Alexandria. Can you just talk about how they were able to collect that many manuscripts, books, and how it became that center of scholarly discovery and scientific discovery during that time?
Yeah, sure. So Alexandria was founded by Alexander the Great. He loved to found cities named after himself. And when he died, one of his lands were divided between his generals, I think 3 of them. And Egypt was taken over by the Ptolemy family. And they were Macedonians. So they weren't even proper Greeks, as it were. They were sort of slightly upstarts, and they definitely weren't kings. So it was very, very important for them to establish their dynasty. And you see this again and again throughout history. People gain power by whatever means, and they then have to make everyone believe that they actually deserve that power. And the Ptolemaic project was very much about culture. They saw Athens, which was at that time the center of the intellectual world, and they wanted to emulate it, and they wanted to use intellectual culture as a means of establishing their own power and prestige, which is, maybe, you could say possibly that the aims of that are not very good, but actually the side effect is amazing. So they pursued this really aggressive policy of obtaining texts, and to give one example that's quite famous, that they founded the library, and then any ship passing through Alexandria, and obviously Alexandria was this incredibly important port and center of trade, they would just search it, and if they found any books on the ship, they would just take them, put them in the library. And they even had I think they had a shelf mark which was from the ships, so it showed that these were all books which had basically been stolen. They also borrowed texts from Athens, sort of original copies of, I think, mainly ancient Greek literary texts. And they were supposed to return them, but they didn't. They kept them and sent money back in return. So there was a very acquisitive, aggressive policy of founding this library. And of course, they then provided huge sources of funding, and they made this place where, as a scholar, there was literally nowhere better that you could be, living in this incredible the museum, as it was called, where you were looked after, you could study, there were other scholars, there was this incredible library. So they just very cleverly made it the most attractive place in the Mediterranean world if you were interested in anything academic or literary. It's brilliant.
For anyone who loves to read, imagine going to somewhere like that and having that and access to that many books. At that time, it must have been an amazing To me, it's an amazing achievement they were able to do it. I mean, the nature in which they were to accumulate it, maybe put that to the side. But
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that they were able to do it and it became that place is somewhat amazing. Was it the first of its type that was able to do something like that?
Well, obviously, I mean, there were other places around. There were, medical schools. There was Athens, which had, the academy and Plato and Aristotle. But I think Alexandria kind of, it stands alone, and it has haunted the dreams of scholars and academics ever since. I mean, it doesn't go away. It's just as powerful today as it ever has been. I think the idea of a library where you can study anything. I mean, there was great libraries in Pergamon and also in Ephesus that were founded sort of around the same kind of time. But Alexandria has a special place. And also the thing I think that it sometimes gets forgotten is this: it was over a huge period of time. It was founded in, 300, 400 BC, and it was still, a great and important centre 600 years later. So it's when we think about it, sometimes you sort of think about it was at one moment or one century, but it wasn't. It lasted for a really, really long time.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when you look back at history, you think of one point in time, you think they just accumulated it in, let's say, like 5 or 10 years. But like you said, it's been accumulated over centuries. So it's quite amazing to think about. And for anyone reading it, and probably for many historians, you probably wonder what would happen if that knowledge remained, what would happen if that knowledge wasn't burnt. Or, I mean, can you just talk about how the library sort of dissipated and what happened with all that information?
Yes. So the whole idea of losing knowledge, I think, is an extremely powerful one. And there was sort of moments in history when people thought, that the library was destroyed at a certain moment, but that's just not true at all. There were moments. Julius Caesar set fire to one of the warehouses when he came to attack the city, and there were, and obviously
that was by accident, though, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah. And then there was, of course, the famous moment when the Christians and the pagans were fighting for control of the city in Hypatia and all that. But that was quite a lot later. But I think the truth is that most of the knowledge that was just lost through neglect. It was all written on papyrus scrolls, which are not nearly so long living as sort of parchment, and they're fragile. And if you leave them and you don't recopy them, the ink fades, they turn to dust. And I think that probably most of the loss was just through neglect and age, and rather than some big dramatic event,
fire or war or whatever. Just leaving it in
or Christians burning the books.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme anyway, in conflicts and burning of books, which perhaps we can get on a bit later. But so the book then goes on to Baghdad, and you said that was actually the first chapter that you wrote, and there was an interesting quote you put in the book, said that merchants hoping to make a fortune, singers hoping to make their name, and scholars hoping to make discoveries. I thought that was a great quote and summary of Baghdad. So can you just talk about the cultural significance in the spread of knowledge as the Muslim Empire fell following the death of the Prophet in 632?
What, in relation to Baghdad?
Yeah.
Well, there was just the Muslim Empire exploded. I mean, it was the most extraordinary growth, and I'm not in any way an expert on that, but they conquered just unbelievable swathes of land in a very, very short time. And then the capital was initially at Damascus, and then, as I explain in my chapter on Baghdad, the Abbasid dynasty took the caliphate from the Umayyads, and they decided to relocate to a more central position, because at this point they were ruling the land basically from the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Indus, right the way across.
Yeah.
And Baghdad was sort of more centrally placed. So there's many legends about how the city was founded, but and I think probably most of them aren't true, but they're very charming, and I talk about them a bit. So they chose this place, and they decided that this is where we're going to build the city, and it was pretty much, there was nothing. I think there was a few villages there. There was actually a Christian monastery there, I think, church there, and so they founded the city, and they laid out the where the city was going to be using dust, or I don't know, but most cities that were founded around that time apparently were laid out in that way. Also, Alexandria was supposedly laid out in that way, but it was a circular city, which was very unusual. And within just a couple of generations, it had grown. And it was sort of similar to the foundation of the Alexandria Library, that the call was put out. There's this new city. We need people to come and build it and live in it and make it prosperous. I think that's something which is interesting, that when you look at history with a very, very long lens, the thing you need, first of all, before you can have any culture or anything, is you need people. You need the weight of population in order to generate, so that you can generate money and so people flocked from all over this enormous Islamic empire to Baghdad. So it was a real melting pot. And I think we're going to talk about that later, the importance of different religions and cultures. And it was this amazing, enormous city very, very, very quickly.
The interesting thing that I found, and I know this anyway because being Muslim and learning about the history of the Muslim growth and the relationship with the Christians and other religions, as well as the fact that you said is calling upon a community or a group of individuals is very hard when they're from different sects. But when they're spread across a massive empire, but they're all under this one banner, it's very easy to call them to this sort of cause to unite.
Yeah, and that enabled that area of land had not been united under one ruler since Alexander, effectively. Yeah. And that enabled trade and, that sort of unification helped connect different places which hadn't been connected before or hadn't been connected for many, many centuries. And that was also very important.
Yeah, a lot of them were like nomadic tribes. And they found their way to urban cities because they didn't like the harsh nature of the desert, which is,
exactly.
To me, it's very interesting, because then you look at like modern day cities like Dubai and you feel like it's somewhat the same.
Yeah.
Because they're Bedouin tribes, and they're sort of come into this mass amount of wealth, and then you just see this massive surge in trade and wealth.
Yes, and then these incredible cities sort of rising out of the dust, out of nothing. I mean, I've been to Dubai, and it is extraordinary. It's just desert, and then this glittering, fantastical city in the middle of it all. Amazing.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing I did want to speak about in relation to the actual competition over information or knowledge was the fact that you talk about it in the book, saying that the old age struggle between the wealthy, who at times wanted this information for their private collections to show everyone that they had all this information, they had all this knowledge, and then competing against like the penniless scholar, you call them, looking for the book to enhance their knowledge on a specific field of study. So can you just talk about that old age struggle between those rich, wealthy people who were just accumulating books and knowledge for the sake of perhaps showing off, but then those that actually needed this information for their scholarly study?
Yes, I think that's quite. I mean, that does happen, and that is definitely a theme. But I think that certainly in Baghdad, the wealthy were much more geared towards actually funding and encouraging the discovery of new knowledge and the study of older knowledge. Of course, there is that tension. I think I mentioned that in relation to actually one of the chapters on Spain. And of course, you always get, these sort of wealthy dilettantes who like to have, who are just collectors. And I think that is an interesting aspect, that whole thing of collecting and like stamp collectors today, and if there's two very valuable stamps left in the world, they buy them both and then they destroy one, so then they've got the last one and it's even more valuable. And that's kind of that's a different that's collecting mania, isn't it? And that's a different thing from actually being proactive. And I think one of the really amazing and interesting things about Baghdad in the 8th and 9th centuries was that scholarship was fashionable, and there were a lot of aristocrats, elites, who were genuinely interested themselves and genuinely talented and genuinely wanted to push knowledge forwards. And they were led, of course, by the Caliph Al-Ma'mun. He was the kind of best, the best example of that. But his, I now can't remember, was it his grandfather or his father, Mansur, they all encouraged knowledge. But Ma'mun was actually personally really interested in it. And he, of course, was patron to these Banu Musa brothers, who were the most incredible inventors. They were, and I think that was a sort of very unusual and serendipitous moment that happened, where you got these very wealthy people who happened to be very fascinated by science. And of course, that had a transformative effect on, they were spending thousands and thousands of pounds per month paying scholars to, they had sort of private institutes within their own houses producing texts and also doing practical scientific experiments and stuff, things like that. So that was really important.
Yeah. Is it similar in that respect to the patronage in the fact that I know in Rome they had that for artists as well, where they had sponsorship of artists because then they fall under their banner. Was it something very similar to that?
Yeah, totally. And beyond the Renaissance, so really the scientific revolution in Europe was the first moment in Europe when you start to get official scientific institutions which are permanent. And so if you are a scholar and you're interested, you can be affiliated with those institutions and obtain funding and that kind of the sort of structures that we have today for science. And they just didn't exist. So if the only way that a scholar could get paid was by patronage, by working for a wealthy man who either was interested in those subjects himself or wanted the prestige associated, or indeed the power. I mean, these people are discovering really important things about that there is a very, very practical application for a lot of this knowledge that they're studying, which, is very useful for rulers. And I think with Baghdad and the Islamic Empire, they were ruling all these people. They needed infrastructure, they needed logistics, they needed roads, they needed taxation systems, and suddenly there's the need for lots of mathematics. They needed surveying and all these practical applications of scientific disciplines, which was a real driver as well for scholarship.
Yeah, definitely. So as we move over from Baghdad into Cordoba, I mean, I visited Cordoba.
Isn't it magical?
It's beautiful.
Such a lovely place.
It's beautiful. The thing I love about it is obviously Spain is very much known for being quite bustling when you go to the cities, whether it's Seville or Barcelona. Yeah. You go to Cordoba, and obviously I've been to the Arab world as well, and you step there and you're like, what is this place? It almost seems like a gem in the foothills. So can you just talk about how it was sort of founded? I know Rahman in 755, I think, landed in the east, what is now known of Malaga. So how was he able to gather support and solidify a backing to get tremendous amount of wealth, and also to accumulate the Library of Cordoba, which I think at one point had like over 400,000 titles or something?
Yeah, so this is quite a complicated story, which I'm now struggling to remember in great detail. But so when the Abbasids back in Damascus defeated the Umayyads and basically threw them out, and there's various stories of them hunting them all down and killing them, but one got away, and he was Rahman the First, and he then travelled across North Africa and made his way to Morocco, because I think his mother had Berber heritage, so he was kind of, looking for people that would look after him. And
Yeah.
the Umayyads were still chasing, the Abbasids were still chasing him for quite a lot of the journey. So it's a sort of very dramatic story. And there's lots of very, very dramatic versions of the story, which I think have been, debunked. But anyway, they're entertaining. So he arrives in Morocco, and, it just doesn't work out for him there. And I think everyone is kind of, this guy is the son of a caliph. So he's got this aura around him, and he's from this, great tribe, the Umayyads. And so he decides to go north over the straits and go to Spain. And at this point, Spain is not in a very good way. The peninsula has been ruled by the Visigoths for several centuries, and there's been plague. Things are bad. And in some sources, they kind of claim that they just welcomed Rahman, and he had this mixed bag of supporters. There were Moroccans, Berbers from Morocco, and all different tribes who were in support of him. And he basically conquered most of the peninsula and chased out the Visigoths. And then a couple of centuries later, his descendant, they made Cordoba their capital. Cordoba was actually a very ancient city. It had been a Roman city. And the library was founded, but it was really his descendant, Rahman III. I should have reread my book before I did this.
Right.
It's so long ago that and he was the real sort of the driver of the library. He's the one who really collected loads and loads of books. So Rahman I got Cordoba going and established trade, and of course they had access to this enormous trading network throughout the Islamic Empire. And they introduced all these vegetables and fruit from the east, and sort of transformed the culinary opportunities in Spain. And a lot of the food that we now associate with Spain came with the Arabs.
The Mediterranean diet.
Mm.
One of the questions I did have though is, like, he basically travelled all that way and through all that journey, but how was he actually able to garner support? Is it because of the connections that he had and his name, or was it just
absolutely? Oh, okay. And for some people, he for those, I think something that is harder for certainly for me to understand, and it took a while. I had to do some research into it. Was the tribal structure of society was such that you were part of a tribe. That tribe would be affiliated with other tribes, and that was your sort of your network. And because he was an Umayyad, he had there was a huge population of people for whom the Umayyads were almost not quite gods, but they were the rulers, and they had huge power and prestige, and automatically had people's support, which I think is sort of difficult today. It's in our modern society, it's kind of hard to understand that.
Yeah, it's hard to understand the tribal nature. I think if you know that Arab society back then, you would know that it was very tribal, because even in the same cities you'd have multiple tribes, and it would be very easy for some tribes to get along, and very hard for other tribes to get along.
Exactly.
But those tribes that you were very, very well associated with, you could sort of go to the grave with, so to say. As we transition then from Cordoba, we then transition in the book. You transition to Toledo, which is in Spain as well, which I'd never heard of, which to me was crazy. But then I did some Google searching, had a look at some photos, and I'm like, I want to go there. It looks amazing.
Yeah, it's also amazing. It's very much you can feel. I think some places the curtain between the past and the present is very thin, and it's definitely one of those places where you can you feel like you can draw back the curtain and you are in medieval Toledo. It's lovely.
Yeah, I mean, it looks amazing. I'd love to visit. So on that one, I mean, I know we wanted to touch upon this, and I thought we'd touch upon this in relation to Toledo. In the book, you said that there were similarities between Baghdad in the 9th century and Toledo in the 12th. So what role did religious freedom play in allowing the spread of knowledge? Because it seems that there's no coincidence that during times of religious freedom produced the best conditions for the spread of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a complicated question. I think there were similarities. I mean, the difference with Toledo was that so just to explain briefly what happened. So Toledo was part of Muslim Spain, and then gradually, I think it was in 1081, the Christians began to encroach back down the peninsula to reconquer it. And they conquered Toledo in 1081. And it was quite a peaceful... So they had been coexisting. And this is another kind of interesting complexity that, there had been Christian rulers of Asturias and sort of northern Spain for a while. And they got on very well with some of the Arab rulers. And by now, Arab Spain had split into lots of small taifa states, they were called. So there was no longer one, centralized ruler. They were, Salamanca was its own thing, and Saragossa. And so the Christians reconquered Toledo, but it wasn't a very violent situation. And so the libraries didn't get burnt, basically, which was incredibly important because Toledo had been a great centre of Arabic learning and astronomy, and there had been these libraries collected there of Arabic knowledge, and they remained. And the Christians arrived, and very quickly, Christian scholars began to realise just exactly how amazing Arabic knowledge was, and how the Arabs in this period of history, which we call the Dark Ages, because in Europe there wasn't an awful lot that was going on, the Arabs had been very busy, and it definitely hadn't been dark. I mean, it had been amazing. So the word kind of went out around Europe, and scholars started arriving in Toledo just because they heard that there were copies of these books. Some were ancient texts, and the one I talk about particularly is the Almagest, which was the great sort of text of astronomy that was written in Alexandria in the 3rd century by Ptolemy, not related to the kings, Ptolemy the astronomer. And so they started arriving and just searching through the libraries. And they had a degree of, they were Christians, but actually a lot of, at that point in Europe, the only people who could read and write really were monks or had been educated in church schools, cathedral schools. So at this point, the Catholic Church was, really sort of a positive force for science.
At that point, then, was there any conflict between the religions at that point in Spain?
Between the Christians and the Muslims?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, definitely. And there was a very deliberate Christian project to reconquer Spain and push the Muslims out. But I think initially, their plan was that they were going to be tolerant, and they were all going to live together in harmony, as they had done under the Muslims. I mean, there were Christian communities that survived however many hundred years of Muslim rule. And this is an idea that just came up again and again and again in my book, that if you really want knowledge to be transmitted and improved upon and to flourish, you have to be tolerant. You have to allow people of different cultures, different faiths, to live and coexist together. Otherwise, it just, you're just, there's no scope for sharing and transmission. It's so important. And of course, for translation, which I talk a lot about in my book, it's vital. If you haven't got people who are experts in both languages to make the translations, especially of these quite complex scientific books, then, it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's definitely a thread throughout the book, and also it's a thread through history. At times when there's the greatest amount of conflict, it seems like knowledge gets lost the most. So,
yeah.
when you were observing that, was that sort of a discovery for you? Did you sort of know that already, or was it one of those things where you found that thread and you thought that's going to be a central point of the book?
Well, I think I knew it already, but I was surprised, I suppose, by how much of a theme it was. I don't know. I think what I find difficult is that we are still in this century now. We're still struggling with this whole idea of, immigration, and that people haven't got it yet, that it's just vital. It's just vital for, human development. And you only have to look at the vaccine. One of the COVID vaccines was developed in Germany by two, I can't remember where they were. They from Syria? They were.
I think so, yeah.
It just seems like such a no-brainer. I don't know. I find it very difficult.
Yeah, as a historian, you must struggle with it, because obviously people are not aware, perhaps, of all the information that you put in the book, or for history in general. And this was actually something I wanted to talk about before we move on to sort of the next city. I think it would be good. I know at the last chapter you were discussing sort of like what's next, or what happened after, I think the last city was Venice. Can you just talk about the Latinization of Arab knowledge? And for anyone who doesn't know about the Latinization, it's like the Arab text, and then in the translation it's sort of, you forget about the origination of knowledge. And that was sort of the central theme of your book, is how knowledge gets lost, but it's also in the transfer. So why do you think most of the Western world don't know where that information is actually originated? Do you think it was due to that Latinization?
Yeah, and I think it's discrimination, and I think a lot of the roots of it are in religion. That once Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, which was the last city, the last Muslim city in Spain to be reconquered, and then there was this sort of awful, appalling destruction of Arabic culture, and also of course the Jews as well were just thrown out of the country. And it's I don't know, it's just so shocking and so awful and so shameful. I feel so ashamed of it, because I come from, I'm not a Christian, but I come from that kind of a background, and it's just, I think it's just appalling, and so sad. I don't know enough about it, but I actually, my book was published in Spanish, and I went to Spain and did quite a lot of interviews for, they're very interested in history over there. So, yeah. And they asked me quite a lot of quite difficult questions, because I think for them today in Spain, they're still coming to terms with their, this whole period in their history. And it was 700 years or something. It wasn't as if it was a sort of, just a 20-year blip when the Arabs were, ruled. I think it has a lot to do with religion. I think it has a lot to do with that awful sort of colonial cultural superiority which developed, which is one of the reasons why I just don't like more modern history. I'm not very interested in it. But I think it's, in writing the book, that was one of the things I wanted to do was, and I'm not pretending, I'm not the first person to have talked about the Latinization of Arabic knowledge, but there was definitely a weird trend at that time. So in the 12th century, which is when it happened, when all these scholars were going to Toledo, there was and it's difficult to know how whether it was motivated by any kind of cultural bias or discrimination, but some writers who translated Arabic texts presented them as being Greek texts. And they were, a lot of, especially in medicine, a lot of the Arabic texts were based on Galen, who was Greek, wrote in Greek. And so there is this tendency to kind of edit out the Arabic bit and just present it as being a Latin translation of a Greek text. And that definitely did happen. But I don't know whether that was to just make it easier for the audience to accept and understand. It's a huge question, and I don't know enough about it. But what I think is really important is that we can't see the Arab contribution as just being, they weren't just translators. I mean, they made the most important contribution. And people so one of my things is Al-Khwarizmi, who's just this amazing mathematician. That's where we get the word algorithm from. He basically wrote the first proper book about algebra. He was a total legend. He should be up there with Newton, and we should all know his name. Every child in this country should know his name and know what he did. And I think that's really sad. I think that we need to just have a slightly broader appreciation. And as I said at the beginning, when I did history at school, I didn't learn about any of this stuff. I didn't, maybe that was just bad luck, and I didn't choose the right courses at uni or whatever, but I didn't learn about the Arabic contribution to science. And to go back to the thing of not being discriminatory and just less, everything, it's always better if it's a kind of common, shared enterprise.
Definitely. And I don't think you're unique in the fact that you weren't taught it. I mean, I think that's the whole point, perhaps, of your book is you weren't taught it, but you feel like everyone should know.
Yeah, and my kids, they do history at school. All they seem to learn about is the Second World War, and I don't get it. Why do we focus so much? I mean, obviously, it's a very important period in history, and we should all learn about it. But I feel that in this country, there's way too much emphasis on war, basically. And you look at the bestseller lists, all those books about battles endlessly, they're the ones that they seem to be the bestsellers. But I'm hopeful that, as more women are involved in history, I just think cultural and intellectual history is so much more valuable and interesting. But that's obviously my personal little soapbox that I stand on and shout about a lot.
No, it's important. It's important, Violet. I think perhaps it's some level of recency bias, but I also do believe that it is, earlier you said it was some sort of colonial attitude. And I definitely do think it's that. I mean, recently we had Kehinde Andrews, who wrote a book on the Age of Empire, and we had him on the podcast. And he was talking about this, about how war is seen as something, it's very much between the oppressor and the oppressed. So I don't know whether that stems into the historical field as well.
Yeah.
But it definitely seems to be a common thread.
Yeah.
As we transition from Spain, one of the surprises I had was the impact in Italy, because you mentioned I think three of the cities are in Italy, Salerno, Palermo, and Venice. So Can you just talk about the spread into Italy? I mean, perhaps not talk about each individual, just as a collective in Italy and the impact that had.
Yeah, sure. So I think southern Italy in the Middle Ages, I think nowadays we very much fixated on Europe and the EU and this kind of entity. And actually, if you take a step back, southern Italy and Sicily, it's extremely close to North Africa. It was also under Muslim rule for quite a long time and was very connected. That's one of the things I love about going back in time, is that the map changes and the connections are just totally different. And that's so exciting and wonderful, I think. So these two cities, which I talk about in southern Italy, Salerno and Palermo, which rhyme, which is very helpful. Palermo, of course, is the capital of Sicily. And, they were very connected with the Arab world. And then they were conquered by these extraordinary Viking, Norman terrorists, basically, this family who then, established themselves as kings. And like the Ptolemies, very much made culture part of their project of, sort of establishing their royalty and their prestige. And at this point you get texts coming from North Africa directly to southern Italy, and then you also text in Arabic, that is, there were great centres of knowledge all along the North African coast, Cairo and places like that. And then in Sicily you get this moment where Greek editions of these texts, which have been translated into Arabic, but these are original Greek, and they've been sitting in libraries in Constantinople for centuries. Luckily, they've been recopied, so they've survived. And they end up in Sicily, where they're translated into Latin. So it's a sort of another thread of the transmission, which bypasses the Arabic tradition. Sicily was that was actually, so I visited Sicily when I was a student, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and that was where I first had the idea, where the sort of germ of the idea for the book was born, because it's such an extraordinary place because of its position in the Mediterranean, and it's also always been extremely rich, fertile land. So it was always one of the first places, if you were an empire on the rise looking to make your mark on the world, Sicily was literally number one on your list of lands to conquer. So it's like a sort of cultural palimpsest. I mean, you can just see the layers of all these different civilizations, and it was also therefore a sort of hub of where different cultures met and interacted, and so that was where I first got the idea. I love Sicily. I think it's an extraordinary place.
I've never visited, but I'd love to go.
Yeah, you should go. And then Venice. So shall I talk about Venice?
Yes.
Venice is a bit of a different situation. Also one of those places that's kind of in two different worlds, because of course it's very connected with the East and Constantinople, and the Venetians have this by this stage, which is sort of late 15th century, the Venetians have lots and lots of islands and sort of trading posts in the Eastern Mediterranean right the way up to Constantinople. They're these, exemplary traders, and Venice is an interesting place because in terms of cultural activity, it's not a centre like these other cities are, where people are actually making discoveries and really pushing science forward and being innovative. Venice is included in the book because that is where all these texts end up at around 1500, and they're printed, because Venice was the first major centre of printing of scientific texts. So it's more a place where knowledge is disseminated. And obviously printing is a huge moment for these books, which I follow through all these cities, because up till the moment that they were printed, there was only ever a handful of copies, probably, 20 or 30 copies at the very most, because they had to be written out by hand, and that was extremely laborious. So this is the moment when they're sort of guaranteed. They're never going to be lost, because there's now so many copies that they won't get lost. So that's why I ended with Venice.
Yeah, I know in the chapter of Venice you talk about the Gutenberg Press and the role that played. I know you just touched on it briefly, but can you just elaborate that on a bit more, and how the impact that played, and obviously the transmission of the information. Like you said, they only had 30 copies, but obviously without something like that, we might not know the information. You might not have known the information when writing this book if it wasn't for the impact of the Gutenberg Press.
Yeah, I mean, printing is one of the really transformative moments in history, and lots of people have compared it with our own age of, the internet and digital media and that kind of thing, because it made information much more freely available. It obviously impacted on literacy rates. Many more people started to learn to read, and that, of course, has the knock-on effect. And this is one of the really kind of, it's one of the really sort of poignant things, which when I think about my research I did and think about my book, is that throughout the whole period that it covers, only probably 1% of the population are being educated at any one time, if that. And they're male, obviously, and they're wealthy. And just imagine how many geniuses that we missed out on? How many geniuses spent their whole life herding goats or having kids, or, you know, whatever it was, all the women, and so printing affected that in a positive way, because it made, it had, you know, a very important influence on education, which gradually became, you know, more and more available, and books became cheaper. And also, when it comes to scientific texts, a lot of the recopying that went on in manuscript form in the Middle Ages, every person who made a new copy made their own particular mistakes, and you know, perhaps sometimes didn't understand the text. And I have to give a disclaimer here that I don't understand. You know, I have a copy of Euclid's Elements, but I cannot understand it. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not a scientist. My husband is a mathematician, so he helps me sometimes when I need it. But, you know, lots of the people that were making these copies, they had no knowledge of the subjects. So mistakes had been introduced. And the great thing that happened with printing was that scholars began to produce copies of these texts, which were based on loads and loads of different manuscripts, loads of versions that they compared and collated and edited and made critical editions, just like we do today. And they were then printed. And because they were printed, there was a degree, I mean, not obviously to the extent that we have today, but there was a degree of accuracy that could be sort of guaranteed. And that was really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you do it by hand as well, there's an element of fabrication, or not only fabrication, but also, for instance, I always think about this with stories of actual history. I mean, you're a historian, so you must think about this all the time, is when information gets passed down, it's like, what is elaboration? What's truth? What's just someone trying to, you know, make someone look great?
Yeah, and what's the bias of the person? So why is the person telling you the story? Who are they? What are their, you know, what's their situation? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, whose side do they fall on? Because that also
and also they
everything.
could just be one of those people that can't tell a story as it is, always has to add in and exaggerate. And, you know, I mean, we all have friends like that, don't we, where you hear the same story again and again, but each time it gets more and more outlandish. And I'm sure a lot of those people that, you know, the sources that history is based on, it must have been those kind of people, because they're the ones that like telling stories. So never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, exactly. Just to round off the topics of the book, I think it'd be good for, you know, you just to really pinpoint not what the purpose of the book is, but perhaps what you're aiming for the reader to get from the book.
Oh, goodness. Well, I hope they enjoy it. I hope,
obviously.
I hope it's, you know, I really, one of my big aims is to write in a way that is easily understandable and also entertaining. I think, you know, I'm not an academic historian. I'm not writing, you know, for that kind of audience, and try and make it descriptive and beautiful. And, but I think in terms of the content, I just, you know, want to contribute in a very small way to making people aware of the truth of our cultural heritage and the breadth of it. And I don't know, it sounds corny, but I do feel that, you know, some of the problems that society has today with, you know, people accepting people who are different. I think if we all had a clearer idea, and I mean, you know, Muslims, Christians, everyone, if we all had a clearer idea of our shared heritage, then perhaps it would be easier not to feel so distant and so other from one another. I don't know. That's maybe a bit of a grandiose aim to have.
I mean, but it's an important one. And I think that is the great thing about the book, because I think if anyone does have any cultural or religious bias, I think it's hard to refute the fact that at times when information was spread the most, it was when we got along the best. Yeah. Which is, I think, is a lesson for us all.
And I guess if I could sort of force people to read it, the people I would be forcing would be, you know, Christian extremists and Muslim extremists. I think those two groups, if they could all have a copy and read it, maybe it would
trying to convince them to read anything that's outside of their their area is very difficult anyway, Violet. So that might be a difficult task.
Yeah, but you can dream.
Yeah, always dream. One of the things I really wanted to ask you, actually, just to round off the conversation, was you have your own podcast where you speak to historians and you ask them which era or time they would like to return to. I'm really interested to know, what are the most popular periods in time they tend to choose? Is it varied, or is there really a specific period of time in which they choose?
The 1940s.
Really?
Is the most common. You can look, so we have a website, I can do a little plug, tttpodcast.com. And my wonderful colleague, the guy who started it, Peter Moore, has done a timeline. So you can literally go on and just choose the years that you're interested in. And I cover the sort of ancient, medieval and Renaissance bit, which is quite sparse, quite spread out. And then the other presenters do the sort of more modern stuff. And the 1940s is definitely the most popular decade, I think.
To discuss or to actually return to?
Well, that's what people choose. That's what the historians that we've interviewed so far have chosen. I don't know. I mean, I do think. I think our preoccupation with that period of history is quite interesting. I don't know. We are still, as a country, and I think that there's certain sort of aspects of the whole Brexit, the sort of emotional that is connected with that era, our finest hour, or whatever they call it. And there's a lot, and I mean, the people that we've interviewed have been absolutely fascinating. There's some really wonderful, and I'm not, in any way doing them down. There's some really incredible, moving. I'm listening to one at the moment that's about, I think, 1941. I can't remember. It's last week's episode anyway, and it's about a massacre in Poland, and it's absolutely, heartbreaking, fascinating. Yeah. But that's definitely I mean, I don't know. Do you ever look on, Waterston's history bestsellers? Do you ever look on those lists and just see? Sometimes I have a look.
So I don't particularly, because I studied a lot of that period of time, and I think I was somewhat put off of modern history about just studying the Cold War. And I did it at school, I did it A-level, then I did it at university. I studied politics at university, so we did a lot of the Cold War, because that was like a watershed moment for politics as well, because of the whole relationship and the East-West divide. And the things I don't like, the divide stuff, to me, reading about it, because when you read a book like this, I'm very much attuned to you, is the fact that our shared civilization grew because we got along together. It wasn't through these moments of divide.
So if you could have chosen a period of history to study, what would it be?
Ottoman.
Oh yeah.
Ottoman and Byzantine. Like I said, I had Roger Crowley on to discuss the siege of Constantinople. I know that's a battle, but it was more to me about the fact that, like, I have because my heritage is Muslim, so we're religious. So I know what our foundation of religion and history is, and I see it the way it's pervaded now, and I'm like, it's just not the same. It's just not the same. And whether it's colonialism, imperialism, I don't know. Whether it's just a not a sparse period of time, I don't know. But yeah, that would be my period of time to go back to, because I feel like that was the golden age of not only knowledge, but also for the culture and the religion itself.
Have you seen Justin Morozzi's book called Islamic Empires? It's absolutely brilliant.
No,
I interviewed him.
Did you?
You should get him on. He's amazing. And we also talked about the siege of Constantinople, actually.
Oh wow.
Yeah, he's really interesting.
Nice. What was your period then?
At school?
No, what would be your period to return to?
Oh well, I actually was a guest on. That's how I kind of got connected with the podcast, and I chose 429 AD, which was a really interesting year. So my first bit was in Constantinople with Justinian, who was revising the legal code, and then Athens. It was the year that the academy, the philosophical academy, closed, and it was illegal for pagan scholars to teach anymore. And they left and went to Persia. And then the same year, amazingly, in Monte Cassino in Italy, St. Benedict founded the monastery of Monte Cassino. So it was this kind of watershed moment of the end of the pagan world of knowledge and the beginning of the
all in 1
Christian
year.
one. Yeah, I mean, probably. Let's face it, it's the 5th century. Who knows? But the sources say it was in 1 year, and they let me have a bit of latitude. You know, the further back you go, the less concrete facts are.
It happens sometime. That's all that matters.
Yeah, exactly.
Hopefully. Anyway, I look forward to listening to that and getting that book as well. I mean, I appreciate your time and discussing your book. I think it's a fascinating book, and as we've discussed, I think there's so much that we could all learn from it, not just from the knowledge inside of it, but just the general principles inside of it about shared and collective knowledge. So the book is The Map of Knowledge. Thank you for joining. Where's the best place for listeners or watchers of this, Violet, to find you?
I have a website, violetmoller.com. And then the podcast, tttpodcast.com. Thank you.
Perfect. You're welcome. Thank you, Violet.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Also, visit our website, www.booktalktoday.com, to subscribe and download the latest edition of our magazine. Join our mailing list to receive the first issue for free, to get a taste for the value-packed content that we are offering. Book Talk Today, for readers, by readers.